the mistake that I see people making over and over again is to think that experimentation is a way that they can prove how clever they are. And I know this mistake because I've been there, I've done it.
Yeah.
I used to think, I've got this great idea and it's going to have a huge impact on conversion and I can prove it and it's going to be wonderful. And of course, it's got no basis in reality. It's just a thing that I thought of. And when you do that enough, you realize that your own head is a very bad filter and it's a bad place to come up with experimentation ideas.
All right, let's get this thing going. Oliver, welcome. Excited to have you on here, have a little conversation, chatting CRO. Before we get started, we'll do some quick introductions. I'm Sheldon Adams. I am the head of growth here at eNavi. We're a Shopify CRO agency, joined today by Oliver Palmer. Oliver, you want to kick things off and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Sheldon. So I am a long-time CRO practitioner. I ran my first A/B test in 2008, back when Google Website Optimize, it was the first tool that really allowed any idiot with a Google login to go in and run button tests, essentially. And I was working in sort of various e-commerce roles and just love the idea of it. I think there's just something about my personality, which means that probably for a lot of us, the idea of using data and experimentation to inform decision-making really, really resonated with me. And, from that moment onwards, as I say, I made all the mistakes, ran all the bad tests, thought I had discovered absolutely brilliant insights. I had not. But was always really enamored of A/B testing and, keen to get more into it. And then about 10 years almost to the day today, I was living in London and I got a call from a recruiter saying, hey, are you interested in being the first in-house optimization manager? I don't think they had that title then at Britain's largest mobile telco. And I was like, yeah, sounds great. And that was, long before there was any real kind of education around this stuff. I think CXL was just sort of a blog, didn't really exist. There weren't a lot of resources. Everyone was making a lot of the same mistakes. And we just sort of had to feel our way through. And I was really fortunate to work in that business. It was a telco that just had a merger of the French national telco and the German national telco. They were really focused on growing conversion, had a lot of issues with a very expensive sort of brand-based website, had a really sort of, supportive, a lot of buy-in from sort of senior people within the business. And, worked there for a couple of years running experiments and was intrigued to discover that the tough stuff was not the technical side of things, it was the cultural side of things. It was helping people to learn that it doesn't matter if they don't know, and helping to kind of instill that sense of humility in an organization. So many people, particularly sort of senior execs in big businesses, in my experience, have this view that they set a lot of store by their experience and their battle-hardened wisdom. But one of the things you learn when you start running experiments is no one knows anything. And I'm still enough of an idiot to think that I know things, but I don't. I'm slowly learning that lesson. And so I went down this path of working with different organizations, went to a big broadsheet newspaper in the UK called The Telegraph, subsequently worked with their product and UX team, did a lot of the same, then spent many years working with Kmart, big, large Australian department store, fortunately completely separate to the American one now, which is still teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Do they still exist, Sheldon?
They may exist somewhere. I think they're basically out of business. Someone might have bought them out of bankruptcy, but
it's funny these American sort of zombie corporate structures. Businesses are allowed to go on in zombie mode for a long time in the US, aren't they?
Yeah, they definitely are.
But yeah, they started, I think, as a sort of Australian offshoot, but have been separate for many, many years now. Very successful, interesting business. And spent many years working with them, sort of building up a culture of experimentation. And as I said, I've found that that's really where lots of my work is these days. Is not the technical stuff, because it's not hard. The hard stuff is, how do you change your ways of working to be more hypothesis focused? How do you learn to embrace that sort of uncertainty and to act on and correctly interpret the results? And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing these days.
That's I think it was a very tough transition for me personally, going from like that real small tinkering, like I don't know, non-research based, there was nothing behind it. The first like couple of years I was in the industry, to like yeah, to now where it's a much more nuanced, sophisticated, and mature approach to this. So you sent over ahead of time here an anecdote you spoke to like with a client where you kind of it's almost like testing like free up time or like the stuff, figuring out what not to do, and
Mm.
was hoping you could kind of go through and just talk through that for the listeners and speak to it, because I think that's a really cool way of using CRO and experimentation that most people probably don't even think of doing. So yeah, you want to
Mm.
dive in on that real quick?
Yeah, sure. So, there's certain websites where it's really hard to use traditional A/B testing to increase conversion rates. It can be really, really tough. Um, and often in my experience, there's a couple of phases of experimentation, and the first phase, and the one that gets all of the attention, is fixing broken stuff. Things that are obviously
Yep.
broken,
Yeah.
you can find them, you can fix them, and that's where you get those big wins that get people really excited. But maintaining momentum over the long term, and as you get more sophisticated, gets really tough, and you find that your win rate, quote unquote, goes down considerably. I should keep these stats to hand because I always forget them. But I know that I think Ronnie Kohavi has compiled a lot of stats from different really mature organizations that are really great at experimentation, like the classics like Booking.com, and he worked at Bing and Airbnb and whatnot. Like Google have reported different numbers, and everyone says, look, most experiments don't move the needle positively. Some move the needle negatively. In my view, that's just as good. And many are flat. And people really struggle with flat experiments. They find them a bit deflating, and everyone talks about the huge wins. And when they don't materialize, in the long term, or they diminish, people go, what are we doing? We're wasting our time running all these experiments. And I had this realization a couple of years ago working with a client where, yeah, we'd fixed all of the broken stuff, and they were also really uniquely positioned in the market. They had great products at a great price, and there weren't a lot of other places we could go to get those products. And in those cases, those sites are really hard to optimize. When people will walk over hot coals to get what you're selling, you can make all of the sort of usability tweaks and do whatever, but it kind of doesn't really make a difference. And so we entered a patch with this client whereby we were just having flat test after flat test after flat test after flat test. And everyone was getting really deflated by it. We were testing interesting things, things that were grounded in research. We were doing everything correctly. And we probably actually were making the site better, but it just wasn't translating into commercial impact.
Yep.
And so this idea actually came from my client at the time, who said, well, hold on a minute. We spend all this time doing things that we don't test, that we think are going to move the needle, that are going to have a big positive impact. What if we just experiment with not doing them, and we can save time, and we can reallocate that time to places where we know it's going to have an impact? And this set us off this path of running all of these tests. We sort of itemized all of the things that the various teams did. So this is working with this is with a sort of quote unquote online team at a big retailer. They had category managers, merchandisers, all that sort of stuff. People that are really working around presenting the best sorts of products on the website and trying to squeeze the most out of them. So merchandisers, they'll often do things like making sure that the products should appear right at the top of the category page. The things that people are looking for, or the sort of best offers, or they'll tweak search results to make them more relevant. All sorts of things like that. That kind of best practice and intuition says this is going to be useful. This is going to move the needle. And so the first thing that we did was we called it tall banners, because what they did, they had on their category pages, they had, completely without thinking, for years, been working with their marketing team to commission and pay for these photos of people using their products, wearing the clothes, interacting with the products, whatever, like catalogs. And the idea had always been people resonate with seeing these photos, these like lifestyle images, and it's a good thing. It'll be good for conversion. Was never really questioned, but it was really cumbersome to do. It was expensive. They had to pay for the images, but more than that, they had to maintain them. The stock ran out very quickly, or it turned over very quickly. So they were always having to work with compliance as well to have compliance on their back to say, hey, this product that's on the page, we're not selling that anymore. You have to remove it. They have to get a new photo. And we worked out that somebody was spending 40 hours a month just like changing these images on category pages because they thought it would have an impact. And so we just tested not doing it. We just replaced it with some text or an image or just something really plain, and did that across the whole site. Lo and behold, it had no impact. They saved 40 hours a month, and were able to parlay that into other activities which do have an impact, that they knew had an impact, like particularly around emails and so on. And we just sort of systematically worked through all of these sorts of opportunities to make sure that everything that the team was doing actually did move the needle. And it was really eye-opening for me that we could use experimentation in that way, and has really informed a lot of the experiments that I've run since.
Uh, that's awesome. Like I love hearing those atypical wins, because I know like I feel like 90% of the conversation in the space is, did it lift conversion rate? And if it didn't, it's a failure. But
Yeah.
I mean that's like saving, I mean, you saved 100 hours a month over like a couple different things. Like that's, depending on how much they pay their people, that is a huge efficiency gain, to say nothing of like cost
100%.
savings. And
Yep.
yeah, like that's just a really, really cool and unique way of putting that. So that's really glad you brought that one up and could expand on that one. And that actually kind of leads into my next question here, because again, you have a great breadth of experience here, and have kind of done it in-house with some very big teams that were very motivated and like bought in, and as well as being a kind of freelancer on the consulting side. So I'd be really curious just to get your sense of the commonalities of like what good clients or good internal teams look like in terms of like the buy-in and the traits that they have, and how are they
Mm.
different from the bad ones? And then, I guess,
Mm.
a preemptive follow up there, how quickly can you tell?
This is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch. Now back to the episode.
So, I mean, I think you can get a really good idea of just how when I assess an experimentation program, the first thing I ask for is like let's have a look at some of your documentation. And so very quickly, even just looking at the way that hypotheses are formed and metrics are selected, I think is a really dead giveaway as to a high performing experimentation team versus one that's just going through the motions. In terms of your question around what separates good teams and bad teams, I think the essential ingredient of a high performing experimentation program is executive buy-in, and it can't just be even the sort of token. We often see situations whereby the CEO and the CMO like went to the Adobe Summit and watched George Clooney talk and went to some experimentation things and bought all the stuff and said we're doing this now and get really excited about it and start demanding big results. Not that. More really ensuring that all the right people care about experimentation and even have it sort of as being part of their role, one of their KPIs. One of the things that I've found has been really important with many of my clients has been whereby the people that are sort of, tangentially related to the experimentation program, like let's say, I don't know, UX designers or I don't know, certain people in the product team or whatever, just have it written into their KPIs that they have to initiate X amount of experiments, per month or quarter or whatever. And so even if they're not on board, they kind of have to get up to speed pretty quickly and want to seek it out and want to learn. And I think that kind of, having that organizational impetus is invaluable compared to so many organizations that buy the tools, launch a few bad tests, get discouraged, and it sort of trickles out, and they do nothing and say that didn't work for us.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I definitely have been there. Of yes, like a senior level person going to a summit, and then like, okay, we're going to check that box. We're doing this, and
Yeah.
then it peters out pretty quickly once there actually has to be subsequent investment or like a focus on it. So that's really makes sense and really helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
Or just not those big results immediately. It's one of those things that vendors and agency alike have been guilty of a lot over the years, is just talking about those huge conversion rate increases that they use to sell the tool, to build the business case for the program, or to sell in the agency, and that just creates this huge burden of expectation. And often programs crumble beneath that. And one of the things that I'm often working with my clients to impress upon them is the promise of experimentation, the fact that you can try multiple things simultaneously and see what works. That's enough. Imagine if you could do that in life. Like, it's a magical proposition as far as I'm concerned. So it's just you don't need that. Don't need that hype.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny. I actually saw a new like targeted ad for an A/B testing platform today, and their whole thing was in less than 90 days, like more than doubling your conversion rate just from these like speculative data and case studies. And I'm like, oh, geez, like
Yeah,
that's just. I feel like we're littered with
it's
that in the
amazing that
industry.
still exists.
Yeah, I mean it always. It just makes it harder, I think, to get the buy-in or to understand what reality should be, like
Yep.
what a big win actually looks like in
Yeah,
reality.
100%. For a
So
long time, I felt really sheepish about calling myself a CRO. I still kind of do, because there's so many shady operators in the space. I think there's less now than there used to be, but there's been a lot of less than scrupulous practices over the years, as I'm sure you've seen too.
oh yeah. So I mean, to that end, next question, I kind of want to steer into it.
Mm.
'Cause, like you said, like there's a lot of unscrupulous people that have ventured into this space, and some of it is just complete nonsense. Some of it's good. Like it's really hard to say without seeing the results. But in kind of like the breadth of your time in the industry, are there any consistently bad bits of advice that you've kind of seen given, or things that when you hear it, you're like, man, I wish I could just kind of slap the person who says that or whatnot?
Look, the thing that, just to reiterate, like, I do think things are getting better. I think things are getting much more mature than they used to be. The thing that springs to mind, and I don't know to what extent, I don't see this as much as I used to anymore, but a lot of this like test everything mentality is very problematic. I think, you don't become booking.com overnight. You're not running hundreds of experiments a week or month. For most organizations, experimentation capability is finite. There's only so many experiments you can run. And I think people need to be realistic about what they can do, and really to be very informed about how they choose those things. The mistake that I see people making over and over again is to think that experimentation is a way that they can prove how clever they are. And I know this mistake because I've been there. I've done it.
Yep.
I used to think I've got this great idea and it's going to have a huge impact on conversion and I can prove it and it's going to be wonderful. And of course, it's got no basis in reality. It's just a thing that I thought of. And when you do that enough, you realize that your own head is a very bad filter and it's a bad place to come up with experimentation ideas. So the one thing I just say to people again and again is, be very judicious about what you experiment with. Don't expect that you can test everything. Think very clearly about what you experiment on and the best place to find those concepts. As painful as it probably is to hear it, it's just user research. It's talking to your users, it's running those qualitative research sessions. And once you get 3, 4, 5 people telling you the same thing, that's a really great filter, and I think that's where you should be doing your discovery. Don't be discovering using experimentation. Discover in qual, validate in quant is really my gospel.
Totally agree. And I was totally that guy early on in my career that I would like, if it
I
wasn't
think we
like
all were,
exclusively,
Sheldon.
I probably like the first like year or so was like, no, I'm not doing surveys. I'm not doing user interviews. If it's not like a heat map or a funnel drop off, not worth testing. And now I'm like
Hmm.
almost like the exact opposite. So I definitely align there. Like I think that's just asking people makes everyone look way smarter and you just get better stuff. So I'm glad you said that for sure.
And I think the point is everyone sort of has to go through that journey. And I oftentimes find when working with clients is that I need to like let them make those mistakes for themselves, and see why that's a bad idea. Because that's the only way I think to sort of get that out of your system.
That little bit of like maturation, once they get to the other side of it, totally different ball game. So I want to give you a chance here, pivoting a little bit and a little bit of time to brag about yourself. I'm always just curious in terms of like, there's a lot of like good results out there. Everyone has them. If you had to like put one and like you're given like your TED talk or your keynote or whatever, and you just have to kind of like point to something like what's the story you're telling or what's the result you're really wanting to highlight there? And I guess how did you arrive at it too?
I feel like it's almost not it's not worth talking about as we sort of touched on before, like experimentation it's like playing the lottery oftentimes. There are things that you can do to increase your odds, like, grounding your experiments in research. But those experiments which get, a double-digit conversion lift, they happen like every couple of years. I've had a few. But they're really rare. And, everyone talks about them. And it makes people think that they're a lot more common than they are. So I almost like to sort of shy away from those. But I think there's one that, I can think of one. There's one example that springs to mind, and it's an experiment that I've spoken about a lot because I think there's a lesson in it. So yeah, many years ago when I was working for EE, the telco in the UK, one of the things I noticed when sort of doing my first initial examination of their website was that their funnel wasn't tracked correctly. There was a step that was missing as people went from adding a product, adding a phone, handset, and a plan into their cart to going into the billing and delivery section. And that was where they added insurance. And I noticed that there was an enormous drop off at this stage, huge. I can't remember what the actual figure was, but it was. Do you know what? I've completely hallucinated that story. There wasn't a drop off at that stage. There was nobody. That's how long ago it was. There was nobody adding insurance at that stage, and that's why it had sort of been omitted because it wasn't part of the funnel. And I just asked around, and I spoke to some of the people in stores. They had sort of lots of retail stores everywhere, and found out, how much insurance are you guys selling? And they were selling an awful lot more than we were selling online. And I watched how they sold insurance, and they said, "Would you like to buy insurance?" Fairly simple, something like 30% of people opted in, and online it was like 0.1% or something. And I went and looked at the funnel, and I saw that the step to add insurance it wasn't called insurance. It was called clone phone. And this is the thing in selling a commodity product like telephony. Everyone's selling the same thing essentially. So brand marketing is really dominant, and they want to add their own spin on it. So they call it lots of fancy things. And I know if I look at Telstra, the big mobile telco here in Australia, they call their insurance thing is called like Stay Connected Plus or something silly like that. Because they bundle up all these other services to make it, less comparable to other telcos. And so Clone Phone was insurance plus, cloud backup. So if you lost your phone, gets stolen, whatever, they give you a new one, plus it's got all of your stuff on it. The problem was no one had any idea what this was. And so I ran some tests using What Users Do, which I think doesn't exist anymore, but was a British remote usability testing site. And I put 5 people through it and said, find your handset and add insurance. And I think no one, maybe one person, but basically no one was able to find insurance. And there was one elderly northern man who spent, I think, an hour trying to add insurance. He was like Googling, he was searching on the forums, he was doing everything. He was really determined. I think maybe he thought he wasn't going to get paid if he didn't succeed. And struggled. And so we ran one of those famous experiments where we changed 2 words, clone phone, into the word insurance, and it generated millions and millions and millions of pounds of revenue. The kicker is brand marketing still didn't go for it, but that's the perils of working in a large organization.
Wow. Yeah. Hey, I believe it. I've lived that one. Sometimes you can't win that battle, but that's a really cool story though. Like I love, especially when you can go into the kind of combining brick and mortar and e-commerce experiences, and actually, literally seeing how people are buying the product and then doing your best to replicate that online. It's such a simple thing that absolutely no one does. Or a lot of places don't even have brick and mortar anymore, but still, just knowing how people think about it is shockingly rare in the industry.
Yeah, I was really inspired by the guys at Conversion Rate Experts. They've got that great book, Making Websites Win, which I think is just a distillation of so much of their wisdom. And I was reading their blog really avidly back in those days. You've got it on your shelf behind you?
It's on that side.
Yeah, I got my copy here too. Back then, 10 years ago, that was one of really the places, their blog was one of the great places to learn about CRO. And they've always been real advocates for doing research. And I can't think of the term, but there's a Japanese term, I think, that comes out of the Toyota system, which translates to go to where the thing is happening. If a machine breaks down on the assembly line, don't talk about it in a meeting room upstairs. Go down to the production line and talk to the workers and find out what's happening, and then you'll fix the thing. And so I was very inspired by that sort of research that they've done. And those guys, they're almost like method actors. They go way beyond normal usability research. They talk about when optimizing for a weight loss program, they join the weight loss program. When they're working on a dating app, they start dating. They find the single guy in the office and they make him date in the app. They are very diligent in the sort of research they do, and I think a really good model for all of the rest of us.
That's actually one thing we don't do this on all clients, but pretty much anything that is feasible. I try to make a point to buy the product, go through the shopping experience, the customer experience, what's the onboarding, what questions do I have? And it's without fail, exposes some pretty big gaps of basically what the brand and their leadership thinks is happening, or thinks people understand, and what is actually happening. And that real estate between those two is a lot of gold. So that's
100%. As the saying goes, you can't read the label if you're inside the jar. I think, as consultants, as practitioners, as people that are external to a client's business, we bring such great benefit just by having fresh perspective, by being outside of the business, not having the, what do they call it, the curse of knowledge.
All right. So I wanted to ask you one more question here, kind of speaking to what you mentioned earlier about the way things are progressing and seemingly, in many ways, improving. So I guess to that end, like 3 to 5 years from now, like how do you see like the next iteration of CRO and experimentation, and what's different if we're having this conversation in 2028?
Mm. I mean, if I think back as to, what's happened in the last 10 years, say, the big thing that's happened, I think, and particularly witnessing a lot of that from Australia, which has really lagged behind the rest of the world in terms of maturity with experimentation, is that it's become a very established practice in many major organizations. 10 years ago, almost no one, certainly in Australia, had an embedded optimization team. Now, most large enterprise organizations do. And I think we're going to see more of that sort of mainstreaming of the process. And we can look to SEO, I think, as a parallel. It used to be that SEO was absolutely the preserve of agencies and consultants, but now it's a very normal and important in-house function, that will have a line into the CMO and so on. So I think more of that sort of mainstreaming we're going to see. Beyond that, I don't expect to see anything truly radical. I've done a good job at ignoring anyone that talks about AI and optimization. It just seems like bullshit to me. I don't see any value in it. I really think that it's as I say, like the promise of experimentation, being able to try different things simultaneously to be able to validate your approach and your strategy is brilliant enough without plugging in the deep mind.
I think we're on the same wavelength there. Like it feels like a consistent, steady march versus something that's truly going to be, you know, completely revolutionary. And maybe we
Yeah,
both look really silly in a few years, but that, I mean, you've been at
probably.
this longer than I have, so yeah, that I have no doubt. But no, you've been at this longer than I have, so I think I definitely subscribe to your theory there. So Oliver, wanted to wrap just by giving, I guess, a chance for you, if anything you want to call out or point to where people can go find more about you if they're still listening, and yeah, just wrap up with any closing thoughts you had.
Yeah, hopefully there's one or two still listening. Yeah, if anyone wants to connect with me, obviously LinkedIn's a good place. I blog over at oliverpalmer.com and have a mailing list where I send out interesting stuff periodically as well. But yeah, oliverpalmer.com is a great place to go.
Well, Oliver, really appreciate the time here. Glad we can make time zones work, and yeah, it's been great, great chatting with you, and hope everyone enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me, Sheldon.